Today's webinar is Funding Opportunities in Multiple Chronic Conditions Research. This webinar series is coordinated by the Aging Initiative, which is an NIA-funded initiative that bridges the expertise and leadership of two powerhouses for research on multiple chronic conditions. Two powerhouses are the Healthcare Systems Research Network and the Claude D. Older Americans Independence Centers, or PEPR Centers. The initiative is led by Dr. Jerry Gurwitz at the University of Massachusetts and Myers Primary Care Institute, along with co-PIs Elizabeth Bayless and Jay Magaziner. My name is Whitson. I'm faculty in the Duke University PEPR Center, and I co-lead the Aging Initiative's Dissemination Workgroup, along with Leah Hanson at HealthPartners. Before we get started, I'm going to cover just a few technical details, as some folks are still just starting to sign on. The number of registrants for today's webinar, we've placed the phone lines on mute to reduce the audio feedback. So unless you're logged in today as a host or a panelist, your line will be muted. However, we do welcome and encourage audience participation using the QA or chat features on the webinar software. So if you're in your Cisco webinar portal and you're under the tab that says Presentation, be able to look to the upper right and see an icon for chat, another icon for Q&A. If you have questions for our speaker today, we ask that you please submit those during the Q&A function. Leah will be keeping an eye out for those questions under the Q&A icon, and our plan is, as time permits, we will read those questions to our speakers after the presentation. One exception is that Dr. Bierman from AHRQ may not be able to stay on for the duration of the phone call, so if you have specific questions for Dr. Bierman, please note that in your question while she's speaking, and we'll try to catch her before she signs off. There will be another AHRQ representative available at the end if questions arise for AHRQ. Now, if technical or logistical questions, we ask that you submit those using the chat function. Sure that you identify yourself either by your name or your participant ID number so that our webinar hosts will be able to help troubleshoot any problems that you may be having with audio or other issues. The chat function, you can choose whether you would like your comment to be visible to all participants, or you can choose to send it privately to just the hosts. And I want to extend a huge thanks to those hosts, Catherine and Zuni, as well as Valentina, Azra, and Jan today. They're doing amazing work behind the scenes to make these webinars possible. They will be monitoring the chat function for technical problems. So now I'd like to get right to it, and I'd like to introduce today's first speaker. Dr. Marcel Salive is the Program Officer in the Division of Geriatrics and Gerontology at the National Institute on Aging. He administers the research portfolio on multiple chronic conditions treatment and prevention, polypharmacy, and some other topics in the geriatrics branch. He's conducted and led research in several aspects of geriatrics, and he previously led Medicare coverage of medical and surgical services, and we really appreciate Marcel's contributions overall to the Aging Initiative and for speaking to us today.
Thank you, Heather. Can everybody hear me? It's a pleasure today to talk about the NIA and our research opportunities. I will try to be very concise in my talk and leave some time for questions at the end. It's one of 27 institutes and centers at the NIH, and so I'm representing that institute, but sometimes can refer you to other institutes if you do have questions on that, and give my contact information at the end. So there are many questions you may not be able to get today, but with our, I want to cover these main topics, a little how NIA is organized, the type of research support we offer, with focus on some of the development awards and the GEMSTAR program. We also offer investigator-initiated awards, and then some more advanced topics I don't have time to cover today, but for example, the PEPR Centers are a major initiative we fund, this aging initiative as well. There's an R24 mechanism, the conference grants and large clinical trials we support. So we'll try to give some resources at the end a lot of reference to our website, which I think is quite usable point in terms of that. So next slide, please. So our mission is to study aging with a variety of tools, and we are focused at this time on genetics, biology, clinical research, behavioral social research, and economic research. And we also focus on development of researchers and research resources, and we do also get the word out through this and through our website and through other public forums to public, scientific, etc. Next slide. So a lot of times people wonder, do we have an age cutoff? The answer is no. So we are interested in aging as well as the ages. And we are interested in what happens in physiology over time in the lifespan. We are interested in specific diseases, their occurrence. We have a major focus on Alzheimer's disease and a major focus as well on multiple chronic conditions. We on age-related diseases, which is most of them. So we do refer to other NIH institutes that have specific diseases, but we have a focus on them on why are they related to age, because it is such a strong risk factor for many conditions. Special needs of the aged, such as in particular multimorbidity, polypharmacy, and the syndromes, which are of high interest to NIA. Next slide. So the grant program sits in the extramural divisions, so that's my main focus today. We have 4 of those divisions, and so here, and those include the top I mentioned, and in particular, I'll say that I'm in the division of geriatrics and clinical geology. Can you click forward? I think there's some building on this. 3 branches, and I'm the geriatrics branch, but we have also a gerontology branch that studies lifespan changes, and the clinical trials branch of large clinical trials. This division is the major focus of Alzheimer's disease. Biology focuses on basic science, and behavioral and social research also includes economic research focus. We have an intramural program, which is the scientists in the institute who study disease and aging on their labs. That is up in Baltimore mostly. So we have wide topics that I listed, some of them here for geriatrics research. I think that the focus is we have close interaction with the community, and we cover important topics of geriatrics, and much of research for the program is investigator initiated. So we aren't really in the position of telling you what to study, vice versa really is the goal. So, but this is my list. I'm happy to add to it if people have new ideas, and many research agenda setting conferences, and try to learn about the forefront and where the research is headed. So from the point of the Aging Initiative, many of these are relevant, and we're open to discussing them at any time. In terms of study design, any design is also possible. Research, so I listed a few selected design in this box. Next slide. So to the website, this is our main entry is listed at the top of this slide, and then a lot of interesting interesting and good information can be found under the tab called Research and Funding. And this illustrates further in research and funding the opportunities that are currently active can obtain through the search function on the website. So this is a source of information about what are the active assessments, requests for applications, etc. that are first released, when it expires. As you see, you can click on directly into it. Next slide. So, already, I'm sure, and I'm trying not to, but just in terms of how do we announce funding opportunities, there are types listed across the top. RFA means request for application, program announcement, PAR is program announcement with review. So, or S is the set aside. Sometimes there's set aside money. So, top ones about which ones do have money set aside. The RFA being the main way to set aside money. This can be from Payline. There is a narrow focus in an RFA, versus program announcements have very broad. The update, single issue, and a competition for that set aside money versus the program announcements are reviewed, are submitted 3 times a year on standard dates. They are reviewed by central percentile and funded across through our pay line. Next slide. Key areas that we want to focus on is early career development, and we've noticed that this is a drop when a lot of clinicians decide to get research, go into private practice, or take an educational track. And so we've tried to, can you click forward, at STAR program to address this need. So this STAR is a small career development program that tries to connect with the mentor with aging expertise and to provide highlight for future funding so that next stages can be attained with more career development awards or our independent investigator award maintained, and the ultimate goal is really independence and being the principal investigator on your own, R1. Next one. So launched in 2011, it's still going strong. Has some limitations, so it is very small. It's got some limitations that people must be on the faculty track. It's mainly targeted at medical specialties, although this year we did add dentists to the next program. So it does geriatrics in that, but it's all the specialties of internal medicine and surgery and medical specialties. Next slide. So career development awards, we have, those tend to start with the letter K. A number of those that run the full length of someone's career, from early mentor career development awards, scientists, and patient-oriented. We have an award which was recently renumbered to the K76, so we were recognizing independence of 76, I think the number. It does have a higher funding, but allocated funding is one of our crowns in the NIA tool. We have pathways to independence as well. K99 with R00, which is some initial early startup acceleration funds. Have aid on paid for leadership development, mentorship in the mid-career. Next slide. We have generally 3 initiated research awards, R03, R21, kind of in increasing order of the amount of money that is dedicated to those and the duration. So we do, for the offer early stage investigator, and this is widely used across NIH, bonus points to increase the success rate for early stage investigators so that the applications have it equalizes the success rate between the early investigator and the late, more experienced investigators, believe it or not. And does work first R01, and it is a strong fact we believe in retaining scientists in the research pool. Next slide. All of these, we do have some targeted funding opportunities that mention multiple chronic conditions, and the others can be certainly submitted under investigator-initiated approach. So some of these are listed here, the ones currently active, and can you
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, my computer. I apologize. So the special fund announcements, these are program announcements listed here. So these are dedicated funding. They indicate the interests with announcements from the NIA that we're interested in management for multiple chronic conditions. This is in conjunction with the Nursing Institute, in behavioral interventions that address multiple chronic conditions in primary care. And this is with several of the other NIH institutes. And then analyses of existing data sets, by specimens to address clinical aging research questions, which is a program announcement that we've had for many years and tried to we had great success, I think, getting the secondary analyses to focus on multiple chronic conditions. Next slide. Of other disease-specific and syndrome-specific announcements that are up there, and this is just some current active ones and more the sunset ones, but we have issued a lot of announcements about aging related to various diseases like diabetes, wound healing, transplant research, inflammation, fatigue, palliative care, and then independent living. And the last one I think I wanted to highlight, just to say that we are more to look at the role of multiple chronic conditions and Alzheimer's dementia and other dementias. And that struggle is now at the Institute because, of course, the Alzheimer large, but also that we want to find out how, the and real patient information about the combinations of conditions that everybody has with Alzheimer's. So don't see a specific disease up here. It's okay. You can still apply kind of an investigator-initiated happy to talk about that further. Next slide. So, the NIH as a whole offers the grant guide. Now it's called just the guide, and the link is listed here. And you can sign up through there for weekly notifications of releases of program announcements and RFAs, and that comes on Friday, every Friday afternoon, and it's quite good. And many people subscribe for that reason to see the latest topics of interest from NIH as a whole. And NIH is listed within that, just any other institute. If you want to go to the same website, drill down, you can do a search there across all NIH for funding announcements, active, and it's quite a useful search engine to find out what's of interest across NIH. Next slide. It's giving a lot of, I think, resources already, and you are at different stages. So, you know, some of these websites are a good starting point. Also provide kind of regular updates that can be helpful, and totally clog your inbox by only coming clearly one time a week. The NIA has a GemStar website, which you know, I recommend Googling it. I think I put it on one slide, but it's super long. Specialty society leadership sites, in particular, we've done work with some of the societies mentioned here. Other resources really on in terms of actually starting studies that offers. I'll get to that in a moment. And even animal resources available data, and conferences that we attend, and ways to contact with the NIA staff. There's a blog which I highly recommend, and I'll give that in a second, and also available for consultation of your aims. The staff of NIA pediatrics branch are available to discuss aims of your clinical studies. Next slide. So this resources are available on this website, which is the highlights that we do. There are ways to get RODIS and others of biological resources, as well as choices for specific studies, such as clinical trials, instruments such as the NIH Toolbox relates to, I think, measuring cognitive functioning, relates to patient outcomes. There are even population studies available through the NIA. Next slide. Listed here, you can sign up to get it every week, and it's for the blog for a real-time update on our pay line on active topics from a more informal perspective than, say, just the funding announcements, which tend to be formal. Another resource for some people is the Summer Institute, which I highlighted here, which is just a program kind of even earlier people than me. If we're trying to acquaint programs to the NIA mission, its resources, and that's very competitive, and the applications are coming, and it would occur in the summer. Each summer occurs, and I highly recommend it. If you're interested in a focused look at NIA. Next slide. There's also something I'd like to highlight for people that NIA has recently offering this, where early career scientists can gain reviewer experience by signing up with the center of NIH. And, you know, ropes of review, because it puts you as the reviewer for your grant and really makes you think about things in quite a different perspective. Next slide. So, the program staff of AA are available to discussions, as I said, and these are some of the topics. The central phone number is listed here, and our individual email addresses, which surprisingly are our first name dot our last name at nih.gov. So we are easily reachable and happy to respond to individual questions. But I want to wrap up now and go forward.
Right. Thank you, Marcel. That was very helpful, and we've already had some requests for the slides, so I'll just let everyone know that the slides can be distributed after this as a PDF, and there will be an email. You can reach out to Catherine Anzuni. That her email is available in the newsletter and the materials that you received about this webinar. So if you email her, you will be able to receive a PDF afterwards. And also, if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. We are going to save those questions to the end just so that most callers have an opportunity to hear all of our speakers first. So I'm going to move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Dr. Arlene Bierman. Dr. Bierman is the Director of the Center for Evidence and Practice Improvement at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, or AHRQ. Dunn is a general internist, geriatrician, and health services researcher whose work focuses on improving access, quality, and outcomes of health care for older adults with chronic illness. We really appreciate her willingness to speak with us today.
Hello?
Yeah, now.
Okay.
You're unmuted. You're good. Okay.
And can I answer slides?
Just give a second.
Okay.
All right, you should advance them now.
It's not advancing.
Oh, okay. Hold on, just for a second. Oh, all right. You know when to advance to the next slide. I'll go ahead and move them forward.
Sure, thanks a lot. So, you know, I'm really delighted to be able to speak to everybody, and here at AHRQ, we're really happy to, you know, get your applications and answer any questions you may have. I know many of you may be familiar with AHRQ and some of you are not, so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to give a brief overview of what AHRQ is so you know what kind of research we're looking for. So AHRQ's mission is to produce evidence to make healthcare safer, high quality, more accessible, equitable, and affordable, and to work with HHS and other partners to make sure that the evidence is understood and used. Next slide. And so how do we do this? AHRQ invests in research and evidence to understand how to make healthcare safer and improve quality. AHRQ creates materials to teach and train healthcare systems and professionals to catalyze improvements in healthcare. And AHRQ generates measures and data used to track and improve performance, evaluate the the progress of the U.S. health system. So that you know, Marcel presented from NIH, which has more of a biomedical focus. Clearly, there are some areas of overlap, but just so you know that AHRQ's research is really focused on healthcare delivery, quality improvement, and that's the area of, you know, what we support. Now, something called the Center for Evidence and Practice Improvement, or CEPI, here at AHRQ, which was created in 2014, and our goal is to generate new knowledge, synthesize evidence, translate science on what works in healthcare delivery, and catalyze practice improvement across healthcare settings. And we have several divisions: the Evidence-Based Practice Center program, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, the Division of Decision Science and Patient Engagement, Division of Health Information Technology, and the Division of Practice Improvement. Next slide. And so, consistent with our mission, there's a wide range of grants related to multiple chronic conditions that would be of interest, including grants that would demonstrate the effectiveness of synthesizing, translating, and communicating complex scientific evidence, to discover, test, and spread techniques for healthcare practice improvement, especially in the ambulatory care settings and community-based elders is a real priority for our center, including the accelerating the implementation of evidence-based practices, where we know that the gaps are often greater for older adults as well as those who have more complex conditions. Also, improve healthcare quality through the use of information systems and data resources to support clinical and organizational improvement. Next slide. The other division that sits within our center is the National Center for Excellence in Primary Care Research. And I put these two next slides up for a particular reason. So I want people to start looking at across all of our funding opportunities and really think about which ones where aging fit in, and because it is really a cross-cutting issue, and where does multimorbidity fit in. And we also have a lot of resources as you're developing your proposals. So we have a whole resource center on the patient-centered medical home. We have a very extensive website with lots of resources on integrating behavioral health into primary care. Next slide. Resources that can support you in identifying measures, and have several measures atlases, including as on care coordination measures, to measure team-based care, as well as clinical community measures. So our website should also be a resource for you as you develop your proposals. Next slide. So AHRQ, like NIA, also produces data, and in particular, we house the Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Plans, which talks about patients' experiences with care, which is a national database. Also, Healthcare Cost and Utilization Project, HCUP, which includes very rich administrative data across the health system, and MEPS, the Medical Expenditure Panel Survey. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about those, but just for you to be aware that those data sets are developed and maintained here at AHRQ and are really a rich source of information. Next. AHRQ has we've had a large portfolio in supporting research in MCC. Some of you on the call may have been grantees, and we our earlier portfolio had a set of grants that were aimed to improve the understanding of interventions that provide the greatest benefit to patients with multiple chronic conditions, the safety and effectiveness of interventions that may be affected by multiple chronic conditions, and interventions that may be needed to be modified for this patient population. Next slide. just here, starting in 2008, we had a portfolio of 45 MCC grants. Next slide. We had another round in 2014 where we additional grants on secondary data analysis related to MCC and methodologic development on how to study MCC. Next slide. So I wanted you to be aware of those because as a result of that, we had created the Multiple Chronic Conditions Research Network, and there's a wealth of information on our website about, these projects. I think looking at them can help you kind of get an idea of the scope and the of research that would be relevant for AHRQ's portfolio. Next slide. Again, we have a funding site that you can go to see our current funding opportunities, and we do use the same process and forms as NIH to accept applications. Next slide. So we use a number of funding mechanisms. I'm not going to read through them all, but you'll have these slides available to take a look at what mechanisms we do support. Next slide. I spent a little time talking about our current priorities, and over the last year, we've issued a set of special emphasis notices to really target where we would like to see work. And one of them is on optimizing care for people living with multiple chronic conditions through the development of enhanced care planning strategies that, are dynamic, that incorporate patient preferences. We have one on advancing the collection and use of patient-reported outcomes and patient contextual data through Health IT to improve quality and outcomes. We're very interested. We have a call around interest in innovative research in primary care. And also, broadly, we have a other one on research that uses shared decision-making as a tool to improve the quality of care for low-income and racial and ethnic minority patients who, disproportionately have multiple chronic conditions. So, don't expect just to see, aging or multiple chronic conditions in our call. And I just really want to emphasize is, really look at our funding opportunities and see how they fit into your work. Next slide. We have a couple of new and upcoming FOAs. We recently released one on how do you use health information technology to scale successful models of using patient-reported outcomes in clinical practice, which we know is essential for, developing goals and measuring outcomes in complex patients with multimorbidity. And we've recently issued a notice of intent to publish a funding opportunity announcements around implementation and dissemination. So those, I think, we would be very welcome, under that portfolio, grants that focus on MCC. And so just keep your eye out for that opportunity. Next slide. Series of current funding announcements. Now, these are PAs, and I listed here our specific PAs. But we also have agency-wide PAs which are broader and where if it doesn't fit into one of these specific targeted PAs, look at those because it may be that your research would fall there. So we have one developing measures of shared decision-making, which we know is key for this population. And a lot of work, we have a large portfolio around clinical decision support. And how do you use that and make it relevant to patients who are complex with multimorbidity? And we have, so one is for scaling and spreading existing models, and there's another one for developing models. Thing is, so AHRQ also has, falls under another center, our CEPI, which is our Center for Quality Improvement and Patient Safety. and the large portfolio of grants and funding announcements related to patient safety. And if you look at these in terms of, medication use, diagnostic error, safety in long-term care facilities, there's a lot there that's worth exploring if your work touches on those areas. Next slide. This is not a current funding opportunity, but I wanted to make you aware of this. We're currently calling for nominations of patient-centered outcomes research findings where there is a strong body of evidence, and we know there's a gap in practice, and we know this applies to this population, because we will invest in the future in doing more large-scale implementation on the topics that rise to the top. And personally, I would love to see, nominations for your models of care or clinical interventions that are relevant for this population and ready, right, for scaling and spreading. We're also conscious that sometimes their evidence isn't as strong as it needs to be in terms of strategies for implementation, and we're very interested in how do you study implementation as you do it to improve care. So I wanted to make you aware of that. Next slide. Like NIA, we also have a number of training grants at all levels, pre-doctoral, postdoctoral, and career development, and welcome grants for career development in this area. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through all of these in details, but I put them in because, we will be able to disseminate the PDF of the slides. So we do have dissertation grants, support dissertation grants focusing on health services research. Clearly, MCC aging-related topics are relevant. Next slide. We also, if you're in an institution that has the NERSA program, we have a set of T32 grants that provides stipends and partial tuition coverage through that program. Those are allocated directly through the institutions that have those awards. Next slide. We have K awards. Slide. We fund KO8s and KO1s. And slide. I'll be brief because I know that Marcel talked about this a little bit more. And just some general tips. The proposed aims of these should be unique to AHRQ and in line with AHRQ's mission and priorities, which is why I gave you that information. And to really spend some time on our website looking at the type of work that we do fund. And the program officers here, there's all kinds of contact names on our website, are really willing to help you and let you know if what the work we're doing is a fit for what we're funding. Next. There's also a very good website with all our training opportunities there, so I encourage you to visit that website if you're interested in applying for a training grant. So that's it, and any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bierman. Real full talk. And I think at this time I haven't questions come through that were specifically for you. So I'm going to go on to our third speaker, and I know that afterwards we'll through whatever questions we receive. So please do feel free to use your Q&A function. And third speaker is Dr. Neeraj Arora. Dr. Arora is an Associate Director in the Healthcare Delivery and Disparities Research Program at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI. And at PCORI, Dr. Arora leads a scientific team that oversees a large portfolio of comparative effectiveness research studies that are aimed at improving patient-centered outcomes for a variety of illness settings. His work includes cancer, multiple chronic conditions, and palliative and end-of-life care. Prior to joining PCORI, he was a program director at the National Cancer Institute for 14 years. He's published more than 95 journal articles and book chapters over the past 2 decades and has always highlighted the voice of the patient in his research, writing, and presentation. So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Arora.
It's my pleasure to be participating on this panel. Next slide, please. I'm going to essentially follow the similar pattern as Marcel and Arlene, give you a quick overview of PCORI for those of you who are not familiar with PCORI, and provide you some specifics on our funded portfolio on multiple chronic conditions, and then discuss our funding announcements and that are relevant to those of you who are thinking about applying to PCORI for contract awards, and give you some guidance about our processes and try to compare and contrast our processes with those of the NIH, given that I was a program director at NIH before I came to PCORI. So I can best to try to do some comparisons for you. And then, of course, we'll open it for questions and discussion for all three of our speakers. Just a very quick overview of PCORI. PCORI is not a federal government organization, though it is an independent research institute that was authorized by Congress in 2010 as part of the ACA. We are governed by a 21-member board of governors that was appointed by the GAO that represents the entire healthcare community, which also includes the director of the NIH as well as the director of AHRQ. So them sit on our board of governors, so then that helps facilitate collaborations between our institutions. PCORI funds, unlike the presentation that you heard from Marcel and Arlene, we basically only fund comparative effectiveness research. And we don't fund grants, we fund contracts. And our studies that we fund engage patients and other stakeholders throughout the research process. In terms of mission, we seek to answer questions, real-world questions about what works best for patients based on the unique circumstances and concerns. So essentially, if you want to think about what kind of studies would be of interest to PCORI, you need to think in terms of decision dilemmas. We try to fund studies that generate information to address real-world decision dilemmas faced by patients, their caregivers, clinicians, or health systems. So very quickly, our mission, which has several elements of AHRQ's mission as well, is to help people make informed healthcare decisions and improve care delivery and outcomes by producing and promoting high-quality evidence-based information that comes from research guided by patients, carers, and the broad healthcare community. So those words are in bold because we ourselves to be a stakeholder-driven organization. So the priorities that we identify as an institution do not come from us internally, but they're all driven from significant input that we receive from patients, caregivers, clinicians, payers, and health systems. Next, please. So more specific on what we fund and what we don't fund, are in the business of funding comparative effectiveness research studies that compares in real-world settings 2 or more interventions that have proven evidence of prior efficacy, or alternatively interventions that may be in common use in clinical practice but have never been tested. So the focus essentially largely is on intervention research. So a majority of our studies are controlled trials, but at the same time we also fund blind CER using observational study designs, and we had several of those. Now, what don't we fund? We do fund development of new interventions and their pilot testing, including development of new decision aids. All evaluation of decision aids within a comparative effectiveness framework is permitted. We are, as part of our statute, not authorized to fund studies that to develop clinical guidelines. We do not fund studies that have their primary aim to develop measures, their process measures or outcome measures. Again, our authorized legislation forbids us from funding any studies on cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. A quick shot of our funded projects. The first CER that we funded at PCORI, I think, was in December 2012. So since then, in the last 4 years, we 570 projects to the tune of $1.6 billion, and these projects have been funded almost all across the U.S. in 41 states, and as well as Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. Next slide. The research we fund at PCORI is guided by 5 national priorities for research that our Board of Governors had identified several years ago. And these 5 priorities are identified on this slide. They include effectiveness research studies on assessment of prevention, diagnosis, and treatment options. So the classic clinical effectiveness research would compare, for instance, head-to-head way of treating a particular illness versus the other, or way of diagnosing a treatment versus illness versus another. Our second priority is improving healthcare systems, and this focuses on interventions that focus on alternative features of the healthcare delivery system and trying to identify what features of healthcare delivery system can result in patient-centered outcomes. Third program is communication and dissemination research. A lot of our work on the science of dissemination, as well as patient-provider communication, shared decision-making, decision aids, sits under this program priority. Our fourth national priority for research is addressing disparities, so set interventions that can help address disparities and in a variety of illness settings. And also fund methodological research that can help accelerate patient-centered outcomes research. Next slide, please. I said at the beginning, we don't fund contracts, we fund grants. So the characteristics of our contracts are as follows. First of all, we fund contracts because we were required to do so by our authorizing legislation. So what does that mean? Our contract period, our studies that we award have a fixed time period. They range from 3 to 5 years. On grants, there is no automatic no-cost extension that you can get. No-cost extensions are considered on a case-by-case basis. Contracts, just like any contract at NIH or AHRQ, if you ever had a contract as opposed to a grant with sister agencies, our contracts have specific deliverables that are established and agreed upon between PCORI and the awardee institution at the start of any study. As contracts are actively monitored by us, the awardees, in the form of a detailed chronological milestone schedule. One thing different from compared to grants is that our contracts are upfront for the entire study period. So if fund you for let's 5 years, that money is allocated to you from the beginning. So you don't need to request carryover funds between years. That money is there for you, and you have flexibility to move around within certain guidelines. Our contracts are very actively managed by PCORI staff, and the idea there is to support all our PIs so that we can help brainstorm solutions to any problems that they might come across, but also to ensure accountability. We will significant amount of money as part of our authorization to fund research that would really make a difference in the lives of people and can transform care for patients in a variety of illness settings in a very short time. So we are accountable to Congress to produce results in a fixed amount of time, and the only way we can be successful is if our awardees are successful in completing the studies as proposed and in the time frame that they proposed to them. Hence, it's very active oversight on our part to ensure success of our awardees in the time frame that we funded them for. And every contract is supported by multiple people, by a team of multiple people at PCORI, which includes a program officer and a program associate that help monitor the scientific aspects of the study, a contracts officer from our contracts office who helps with budget issues, and we have an engagement officer available for all of our studies to help investigators with issues related to stakeholder engagement. We realize that in the spirit of making research to be done differently that involves patients, caregivers, and other stakeholders from the get-go, from the very beginning in a study, A lot of investigators are not used to doing that, so our engagement office tries to facilitate that and help our awardees as best as we can. Next, please. So, multiple chronic conditions, why is PCORI interested in multiple chronic conditions? I'm just going to state the obvious, given that all of you are interested in this topic. This is no new news to you. The rising prevalence of multiple chronic conditions in the U.S. population. This is an area that impacts and is going to impact a large proportion of our country, and we see the very patient-centered issue, especially given my illness burden that is faced by patients and families, and the fragmented healthcare delivery system that they are usually confronted with. Most patients with MCCs are often not included in clinical trials. Hence, there is a need for real-world comparative effectiveness research that needs to be conducted in settings where these patients receive their care. And more importantly, as importantly, the issues faced by patients with MCC cut across all of our 5 national priorities, so including clinical comparative effectiveness research, improving healthcare delivery systems, improving communication, shared decision making, and obviously disparities research is very important for this population. Next slide, please. So to date, we have funded about 50 CER studies on multiple chronic conditions amounting to over $180 million. The part shows the distribution of number of projects by national priorities. So if you see 17 of them are funded focusing on different aspects of healthcare delivery. 16 of the projects have a specific focus on reducing disparities for patients and caregivers dealing with multiple chronic conditions. Each of them focus on clinical CER, 6 is a focus on communication research, and then we also have 3 method studies on this topic. Next slide, please. Bar graph essentially shows the number of projects. So each bar refers to the number of projects by certain chronic conditions that are focused on in some of our studies. So, for instance, 50 studies put diabetes as among one of the multiple chronic conditions that those studies focus on. The 10 studies that are unspecified, so a range of multiple chronic conditions, but there isn't any single study that's a condition that's highlighted as a major focus of those studies. We have about 7 in hypertension and so on and so forth. And the idea behind this graph is to show that our MCC portfolio focuses on range of in this area. So next slide, please. So this, I'm going to spend some time on this slide in terms of opportunities for applying for PCORI funding. So we call our funding announcements PFAs, that stands for PCORI funding announcements. And for this audience, I think we have 2 funding announcements that are very relevant. One is our what we call broad PCORI funding announcements. So these funding announcements solicit research community's best ideas under each of our 5 national research priorities. So they're akin to investigator-initiated proposals that are familiar with. It's like your standard R01. So these funding announcements come out in cycles every year, and we fund studies up 0.5 million to 2 million in the cost over the course of 3 years. And the Improving Healthcare Systems priority also funds studies of $5 million in direct cost over 5 years. And this recognition that health system related interventions often tend to be much more complex. So, these funding announcements say, if you are pretty broad, that's why we call them broad. It's up to you as investigators to propose a CER study on any this area or on any topic that is relevant to any 5 national priorities. And these form a significant chunk of our research portfolio. But we also fund large pragmatic clinical studies. These studies like the broads that are, to investigator initiated on the specific topics, these are more focused. The PFA would identify specific research topics that reflect national priorities or patient-centered outcomes research that we at PCORI have identified based on significant stakeholder input over the course of several months in terms of while preparing for these PFAs. And these priority topics that are identified in the funding announcement have been then have to be approved by advisory panels and our subcommittee of our board of governors. A lot of work is done behind the scenes at PCORI to identify the priority areas that go in these pragmatic clinical studies funding announcements. And tend to be very large head-to-head comparisons in large representative study populations, and the other is to do definitive research study that needed before an intervention can be taken up in clinical practice. And we fund, given the stature of the studies we fund, these are also expensive studies. We fund a maximum of $10 million in the cost over 5 years. And this PFA also comes out in 2 cycles every year. And then I have a website there on our URL on pic.org/funding opportunities that provides wealth of information for potential applicants, right from how to begin our letter of intent process to resources after you get funded. So talking about why, I want to mention that we have for both our broads PFAs as well as our PCS PFAs, we have a competitive letter of intent process. So once a funding announcement is out and you are interested in submitting a potential application to PCORI, you need to send in a 3-page letter of intent that is competitively reviewed by PCORI staff, and we identify and invite a number of applicants back for a full application, which then goes through a full-blown merit review, and based on the merit review, then we make funding decisions. And you can feel free, just like at NIH and AHRQ, to phone and talk to any program officer anytime in this cycle, and we are happy to discuss with you your ideas. We have, as I said, the PCORI website has a wealth of information, but specific questions, you may direct to pf@pcori.org, and our help desk can then triage your questions to appropriate people to help and guide you with your specific question. A note on stakeholder engagement. As I alluded to earlier, that we have an excellent engagement office that was created to not only solicit feedback from the extramural community on PCORI's research priorities, but also then to help our awardees with engaging patients, caregivers, and other stakeholders throughout the research process. So, at context, okay, I lost my slide. So that picture of the beaver that just showed up. Right there, PCORI engagement rubric. That context, our engagement office has created wonderful resources, and all of that is at the bottom of the slide. But one of the things they've done is they've created an engagement rubric that is a practical guide for all potential applicants, but also for our merit reviewers who sit on study section, and for PCORI staff as well, on what are the elements of effective engagement and research. How do we should we engage patient stakeholder partners, for instance, in planning the study? What are their roles in conducting the study, in disseminating study results, etc. So the rubric on our website really will provide you with excellent guidance as to what our expectations are in terms of engaging patient and stakeholders in your study process. It includes, for instance, a sample engagement plan. It includes compensation framework for involving stakeholders in your study, etc. Next slide. So this is my final slide, just a note in terms of, so you get an idea of how do we review and evaluate applications once your application comes in. So there are 6 merit review criteria for all of our studies. Criteria are as follows. Your study is evaluated on the impact of the condition on the health of individuals and populations that you are studying. So it can either be a condition that is highly prevalent in the US population, or it could also be a study with very less prevalence, but it has a high burden on patients and their caregivers. So one of the criteria. The second is the potential for your study or the interventions you're studying to improve the delivery of care and outcomes. And one that is looked at here is that you're proposing and evaluating in the framework of a comparative effectiveness research study is scalable. So if your study is successful, is it likely to be taken up by providers and purchasers so that they become part of clinical practice? The criteria, of course, is technical merit. The fourth criteria, which is new, it used to be implicit in our reviews, but we made it explicit. Concerned with the NIH review criteria is the qualification of investigators and the environment. Are the investigators really have the experience and expertise to do the kind of head-to-head intervention research that we tend to fund at PCORI? Final two are essentially unique to PCORI is evaluation on patient-centeredness. Are you really addressing a topic that is patient-centered, that reflects issues that are faced by patients and their caregivers? Are the outcomes patient-centered? Are the outcomes that something the patients and the caregivers would really care about? And finally, your plan for patient and stakeholder engagement. And pre-application is, unlike other agencies, evaluated by a panel of 3 scientists. Typically, that's 2 subject matter experts and 1 methodologist, but all by 1 patient and another stakeholder. That could be either a clinician, a health system leader, a purchaser, depending upon the topic of your application. And once the scores come in from merit review program, then review the scores, and based on our program priorities, we make recommendations to our board of governors for what we want to fund, and then our board of governors then finally makes the funding decision that is then announced in a public meeting. I would note that we do not have any pipeline for any cycle, but we have dedicated funds set aside during every cycle. So it's like PFAs are akin to RFAs. So every cycle we have amount of funds set aside, which is made public, the funding announcement. Then we aim to fund as many studies as we can for the amount of dollars that we've been granted by our board for that cycle. So that'll stop. Thank you.
Dr. Arora, I'm waiting to see if Leah is on. Not. So far, there are only a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm going to go ahead and I think this is sort of directed to all of the agencies. So there's a question about funding that is available specifically for palliative care. I know several of you touched on palliative care, but maybe we'll start with Marcel, and if there was anything further that you want to elaborate about anything specifically available for palliative care that you're aware of.
We have some funding announcements for palliative care, which they're pretty broad, I would say, and, but it's recognized by us as a gap. So we're trying to boost the science of palliative care, and I believe that's in conjunction with the institutes also.
This is palliative care is big priority for us at PCORI, and some of you may be aware. We recently had a very big funding announcement. Our board had set $48 million for large multi-site clinical trials on palliative care, essentially focused on community delivery of palliative care with two key questions. One focused on facilitating advanced care planning over time, and the other one focused on compare different models of community-based delivery of palliative care. So that funding announcement, it was a one-time solicitation, at least for now, and we received a lot of applications for that, and those applications are going through my review as process. But we also funded several actually, studies on palliative care as part of our broad funding announcement that I talked about before. It is definitely a high priority for us.
I don't know if Dr. Bierman is still on, and if not, I know her colleague, Dr. Rick Riccardi, was potentially available.
Rick Riccardi, can you hear me?
Can hear you. Thanks for being on, and I don't know if you wanted to speak to any potential palliative care opportunities that were available.
Palliative care would be of great interest to AHRQ, particularly we have FOAs around the concept of shared decision-making, and certainly there's a lot of shared decision-making around palliative care, both from patient preferences, et cetera. So, yeah, I mean, that is something looked at AHRQ if it's a systems approach to instituting palliative care or also approaching palliative care from a shared decision-making perspective. There are opportunities for funding in that area.
Thank you. And then another question that I have, and this one is specifically for Marcel. So asking about early stage investigator status and new investigator status. And the question is, it says, to clarify, is R01 the only mechanism that will take early investigator status? And then it also asks, is NIA accepting new investigator status for any of its mechanisms, such as R21?
Okay. So
you may want to take a moment to,
I'll give you some
define. There you go.
So new investigator means they've never held an R01 NIH or its equivalent, whatever you decide that. And early stage means no higher R01 and also is within 10 years of finishing their research training. So we use those categories only for R1s to give beneficial funding grants for those, So if you look on the NIA pay line website in the blog, in our you can find our pay lines and see the difference, and it's substantial difference between if the pay last year was 11th percentile for regular R01, then the new investigator percentile pay line was 19th percentile, and the early stage investigator 21st percentile. So it's a substantial benefit. We do only do it for R01s, but it's mainly so that because recognized issues in the past and recognizing that as the currency of independent investigator, trying to promote people to be independent investigators. That's how we do it. So I will say that we change a little bit each year. It's been we've been offering it for at least 10, 15 years, and it's not going to go away. But by the token, the other AHRQ grants, R03, R21, don't count as R01, so you can get 5, 6 R21s, and you're still a new investigator. So, and get your first R01. That's, we see occasionally that type of experience, and that is what we do, just as a way of recognizing that the early stage and new investigators they can make this release.
Great. And I do have another question that I think is specifically for Marcel. It's referring to one of the slides, I think, that said OA and HIV. And can you confirm what that OA stands for? Is that osteoarthritis?
No. It's like the OAIC epicenter, older adults.
Oh, okay, got it.
So yeah, sorry that we occasionally lapse into that, and it's not osteoarthritis.
Okay, and your audio is a little bit not as clear as it was before, at least for me.
So, and one
clarify, that was for older adults, HIV in older adults.
Yes. So we have a strong interest in aging and HIV. That's what that was talking about.
Okay. Got it.
In the case of HIV, it's sometimes she's over age 50. And to the palliative care, I would just say that there are definitely program announcements on the title is Advancing Science of Geriatric Palliative Care that NIA has that are active now.
So I do a couple of other questions that have been submitted. So one question is asking, are there dedicated trans NIH or multi-institute going across your institute programs specifically for genetic epidemiology of multiple chronic conditions?
The way there are certain things that are done across the institutes, very specifically, but then there is, for investigator-initiated research in that area, there are ways of sharing the burden that can come into play in terms of dual assignment of a grant. And so people can talk to us about their ideas, I think might be cross-cutting, and a problem might be for that NIA, but the secondary assignment allows other institutes to consider if it meets their priorities. Two cross-cutting multiple chronic condition topics. The one that's prominent right now is pragmatic trials, which Neeraj gave a great overview of pragmatic trials, and NIA actually, and many institutes are collaborating on pragmatic trials, and there is a webinar tomorrow on that topic if people are interested in that specifically.
Where on that if they wanted to know about the webinar on pragmatic trials?
So it's listed under in the guide. There is an announcement of it. So it falls the NIH Healthcare Systems Research Collaboratory, and it's specifically the RFA number M16-019, and you can find the information by searching that RFA, and it's listed there under the top.
Thank you. I don't know if genetic epidemiology is as relevant to the other two institutions, but Rich or interested, or if you want to comment on genetic epidemiology of MCC.
We, at least at PCORI, don't fund any epi studies. Like I said, we fund largely competitive factors research of head-to-head trials of intervention. So Rick may have an answer.
Hi, Prichard from AHRQ again. I don't believe that we would have any relevant types of opportunity announcements in that area. I know. Thank you.
Okay. I do have two more questions in the queue. Next question is, what research questions and approaches would you say have received the most funding in the last few years? And what topics are, I think in some ways each of your presentations covered the next one, which was what topics are your organizations looking for future funded projects. But I wonder if you could each maybe take just a minute to think about which research questions or approaches you feel like have been the most well-funded over the last few years.
Well, this is Marcel. So it's multiple chronic conditions. That's a question to answer. I would, we've had relatively equal funding for most topics that we have funded. I think the institute, the institute at stepping back funds, a large percentage of our budget is for Alzheimer's disease research. So, and we have received a lot of new money for that in the last few years. So it outstrips multiple chronic conditions. But I think if you want to know that NIH has funded, there is NIH Reporter, a website that lists funded grants, and search that and find out exactly how much money we spend on a lot of different topics. And we provide, we code our grants in a way so that you kind of lump things together. But things like multiple chronic conditions that don't lump very well the coding system. So, it's not a perfect system for what has funding, but it's definitely available to everyone in the public.
Rich, try to take that. Do you feel that there's a particular area or approach that has received the most funding related to multiple chronic conditions?
Earlier by Arlene, the GOLD website has all the, you can, just like Marcel talked about the NIH Reporter, go on the AHRQ Gold, you can find prior funding. From the AHRQ perspective, what's been funded prior doesn't necessarily predict what's going to be funded in the future. So always, because much of that funding was around Construction Act. So focus on looking health systems approaches and how taking a health system approach can improve the delivery of care to patients with multiple chronic conditions, looking at ways to do practice improvement at the point of care and managing data to help inform cares and practices at the point of care to improve the care they deliver. Another aspect or approach that one might take in getting to AHRQ is how are the aims in this research study adding to a learning health system or improving a system to make it to become a learning health system? And I'll air.
Thanks. Finally, Neeraj, do you want to speak to high priority?
Real quick, and my answer is going to be very similar as Rick's. So for us, what's really important is for you as applicants to really identify what is the research dilemma that you are trying to address. It's a clinical question that will go to our clinical or whether it's a healthcare delivery related issue or it's a disparities issue. You need to really articulate what problem that the patient and caregivers or the healthcare delivery system is facing, that the interventions you're going to study are going to help address that. That's more important than looking at what we funded and what we've not funded. But just as in terms of, as I showed in that pie chart, majority of our projects that we funded so far on MCCs are either directly addressing an issue of healthcare disparities or an issue of healthcare delivery system. systems. But doesn't mean that communication issues or clinical questions are not important. We just haven't need meritorious applications in those areas.
So with just 4 minutes left, I'm sort of going to ask you to consider I have two questions, and these will probably have to be our last questions, and I'll ask you to sort of consider them together because they both ask very specific questions about a particular project idea. So one person has asked, are you open to funding towards workforce development and care management with focus on aging or very aged and home-based care options for severe chronic care stabilization? So again, workforce development. And the other question says that this group is working on improving patient outcomes through an interdisciplinary approach with the focus on biopsychosocial and spiritual care model. So both of these people, I think, asking what funding opportunities and which agency might be the most appropriate for these two ideas. I think maybe we'll just go in the same order. Marcel, do you want to answer first?
Okay. So, NIH is not focused a lot on workforce development. We do, a part of a project to get everyone to the same level for attention to deliver. Depending on the size of the work of the people delivering information in a specific study, and then I think outcomes of the study can include dissemination products like that might be useful for that. But I think in general they're more the side product of the research and the assurance of the research. So, but the second part I think about testing specific models for improving health outcomes is certainly a high interest of NIH and
Okay. So the first one on workforce development and second question on biopsychosocial model and spiritual care.
The first question, workforce models, obviously AHRQ would be interested in delivery models. So in terms of what the right composition of a healthcare team, provide care to populations with multiple chronic conditions, and how do they impact the quadruple aim? So training, it would be involved in delivery model development. So depending on how the was structured, that was training and development could very well be part of a care delivery model of the future. No, we're looking to move in untraditional ways in the way that care is delivered to provide best care for these very difficult and challenging patients, to include that have mental health and behavioral health comorbidities, and how can that be structured and what kind of training would be needed to develop models of care around service delivery. As far as the second half, I think if we were to build those types of questions around the contextual factors involved in caring for patients with multiple chronic conditions, and how would you gather that information around the patient values and preferences in those areas that you mentioned, perhaps even their spirituality, mechanisms from a systems perspective to get that information to the care delivery teams to help provide patient-centered care. Yes, AHRQ would be interested in that. I'm going to give Neeraj some time too. Thanks.
Okay.
I'm out of time, so I'll quickly chime in and say, so in general, I should have mentioned during my presentation, if it was not obvious, that the study that tends to be successful at PCORI is one that already has a demonstration of efficacy. So, you probably in R21 through NIH funding or even an R01 through NIH or AHRQ funding. And you feel that there is some evidence that this intervention works in potentially controlled settings. And then you want to do the next step to compare it head-to-head with other interventions. So, to Rick, we definitely fund a lot of studies in our healthcare delivery program, looking at different ways of organizing healthcare and seeing what impact they have on patients and outcomes. So, for instance, in our palliative care announcement, we actually called looking at home-based delivery of palliative care versus traditional models of delivering palliative care. So that is in interest, but we would not fund studies that are looking at evaluating de novo different approaches for workforce development. I'm saying for the second question is that we would definitely be interested in looking at interdisciplinary approaches on different aspects of the whole patient care, but the approaches that are your application have to be tested in prior studies to show some efficacy data for them.
And I want to just end by saying thank you again to all of our speakers and panelists today. We really appreciate you taking this time. This is very valuable time. Thanks also to the team that was working behind the scenes to troubleshoot and monitor the webinar software. And you should be able to all see on your screen now Catherine's email, so that if you would like to request today's slides as a PDF, that's your email for that. Appreciate everyone's time. And we look forward to our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather.